Thank you all for coming through to Readings tonight. My name is Nico. I'm one of the events team and one of the booksellers here, and very glad to have you all here and to have a wonderful author here to celebrate this book that's just been released. Before we get going with the event tonight though, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and point out that this is Indigenous land. This is the Kulin country, and the people who are the traditional owners of this land are the Wurundjeri Wurrung people. And I'd like to think that with the work that we do here day in, day out, part of it goes in turn to a process of reconciliation and truth-telling, and that's something that I'm committed to. And with that, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the past, those healers in our lives today and in the present, and those to come in the future who will help lead us towards reconciliation and truth-telling. I got an email about 3 or 4 months ago from one of the events team saying, there's this book coming out, you might be interested in it, Nico. It's in one of that funny little series of 33 and a third books put out by Bloomsbury over from the other side of the world in London. I said, oh, why would I be interested in it? They said, well, it's about electronic music, which I love.
Tick.
Yes. And the author is based here in Melbourne. I said, oh, what album is it? They said, it's Kraftwerk. I said, well, I'm very excited about that. Thank you for sending through it. And so I've had a back and forth email exchange with the author here tonight, who I will introduce in a moment, with the publishers at Bloomsbury here in Australia and in the UK, trying to get this book here as fast as possible. I'm sure you all know that we had one event a couple of weeks ago that was postponed, but I'm very glad to be able to welcome you here to celebrate Computer World by Steve Tupai Francis, and I would like to welcome Steve here tonight. So please give Steve a round of applause for coming to join us. Steve, I know that this is a book about Kraftwerk, and maybe this is a roundabout way of asking, but could I ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to Kraftwerk, if that'd be all right?
Absolutely. I like talking about myself. That's not a good way to start, is it? But why Kraftwerk? So it's funny, it goes all the way back to growing up in Frankston, of all places. Mum and Dad are here actually, and my auntie and my brother. The most Anglo place on the planet, almost, and not very many Tongans there. Hey, Mum, in Frankston. But it's funny how I actually came across Kraftwerk was the funniest thing. We used to go to the Frankston Library all the time, and at the time, like this is probably the late 70s, early 80s. There were no CDs at that time, Nico. It was cassettes, and they had a cassette borrowing library. And one day, this is a very amazing moment for me, I went into the Frankston Library to this hallowed space, the cassette library, which was like this big, huge round room. Cassettes from the floor to the ceiling, just everywhere. But there was this one cassette that I could see in the distance. It was kind of glowing. It was this garish, horrible yellow, and I'm like, what the hell is that? It sort of drew me, drew me towards it, like some sort of, I don't know. And I picked it up, and it was like, so I've never seen an album cover like it. So on that day, I picked up that cassette, and I picked up another cassette by a band called Japan, called Gentlemen Take Polaroids. Took them home, and because before that, I should explain, my first single was Fox on the Run by Sweet. That was the first single I ever bought. The first album I ever bought was Kiss, Dynasty. And then I bought 17 other Kiss albums after that, so I was a bit obsessed with Kiss. Thankfully, my auntie Merle, for Christmas, she gave me Blondie's, The Best of Blondie by, and that was my sort of, oh, okay, there's something other than Kiss out there. And so when I brought home Computer World and I brought home Gentlemen Take Polaroids, it did really just blow my mind. And so I went straight over to a record shop called Brash's, and I bought this one. This is my original copy from 1981. This was $9.99 The sticker fell off the other day, unfortunately. I always try and keep my stickers on. And gentlemen take Polaroids. $9.99, brushes, still there. Very proud of that. So, yeah, I thought I'd bring those little artifacts along. But in terms of my background, you know, this is my first book on music. So, you know, I'm I've got a PhD in anthropology, so I've written academic things. And actually, here's a little thing. I'm an anthropologist, but because I'm half Tongan, I thought, hey, anthropology live in the village. Hey, islands, I'll go and live there for a couple of years, you know. And so I did a lot of ethnographic research, sitting on the beach. No, not sitting on the beach. You know, talking to other Tongans about migration and movement. So PhD in anthropology, lots of writing there. I've also been in the for-purpose sector, like Australian Red Cross, where Lou, we used to work there. Policy advocacy, so important but slightly boring. So during lockdown, my wife B, there she is, she said, Steve, we're in lockdown here, why don't you just start writing about your passion, what you really are passionate about, and music. So I haven't got as big a collection as Bruce Butler over there, but I've got probably 4,000 albums, LPs. And so I thought, hey, why don't I start writing a review of one of my albums? And one of my first ones was Computer World. Yeah, so a year and a half later, got into the writing mode, thought I'd love these 33 and a third series. I'd love to be able to, you know, do one of those. And David Bowie is my first love, most people know. But there's already a couple of those. I thought, oh, computer, no one's done Kraftwerk. Someone needs to do Kraftwerk. So that was the journey, Nico.
Yeah, nice. And I should point out, Valet, thank you for introducing Steve Tupai.
Yeah, my first 17 albums, Kiss.
Nothing against Kiss though, you know. No. Great energy, and great face paint. You know.
Absolutely, but just a lot of Kiss. That's all.
Well, maybe we'll leave Kiss for a moment. We can sign them aside. I'd like to maybe get into Kraftwerk if we could.
Sure.
But so in this book, this lovely little book, you open one of the chapters with this quote that I'd like to read back to you, if that's okay. Or actually, it's a quote from Emil Schult, who is the fifth Beatle of Kraftwerk, and he writes.
Shall we tell everyone about what, you know, because he designed the album cover.
Oh, we can get to that.
Oh, we get to that. Okay. All right.
Maybe as an introduction. He wrote, Kraftwerk was a fortunate cooperation and exchange of three cultural individuals with emphasis on art, music and technology, reaching for a local, national, international and cosmic expression, which I thought was a really nice way of giving his very astute observation of what Kraftwerk is. So for those who are uninitiated, can you tell us a bit more about Kraftwerk?
Sure, happy to. Four amazing individuals from Dusseldorf in Germany, also known as like the kind of the jewel of the industrial part of Germany, really. And in the book, I talk a lot about their background because they kind of talk about themselves as this new generation, this generation that is post-war, post the Nazi kind of the trauma of that Nazi period. And they kind of, part of their project, and this is why I like them so much, it's not just music. They've got this cultural project happening as well, in which they reach back to the Weimar Republic. They kind of want to skip that and this is a project of their whole generation. They're kind of trying to move on from, acknowledge Nazism, but move beyond it and create a new German identity as a generation. And that, as part of that, they wanted to remember the past that they liked. So they skipped back over to the Weimar Republic, the 20s and 30s. Their favourite film was Metropolis, their Bauhaus architecture and all of the Gropius, what he achieved with the Bauhaus. They reached back to other types of art. And so I think you asked me why do I like Kraftwerk or where they're from. So part of it is they're almost like this they love this industry, industry and the production of mankind and humankind, I should say, is something that they really focus on and that they actually love. They love the products of industry. So it's kind of they're like a love letter to German industry, but also beyond that, as a new generation, it's a love letter to a pan-European. So they're kind of, I see them as reaching out to be this new entity of Germany as part of Europe. So there's this kind of historical kind of, they're trying to reconceptualize things. So their background, actually Florian was from a very wealthy family. They were all well educated, they went to university, they were immersed in the Fluxus movement and in art and design. So there's so much more going on with them than just music. So they actually were classically trained, all of them. Joseph Beuys, the famous Fluxus professor and artist, was actually one of their professors. It was Emil Schultz, professor. So they kind of come from this, it's not just electronic music for them, it's this whole huge concept that they're trying to achieve, and it's very German, it's very, so very, very foreign from someone in Frankston at the age of 13 listening to it for the first time going, what the hell is this?
Yeah, absolutely. But there was something really profound and very striking about how it all comes together in this really holistic way, to where I think even if you're, as you say, Toadville and Frankston, and you don't really know what the Weimar Republic is, or you don't know what Fluxus is, there's something kind of shocking about that album cover and about that sound that I think cuts through and really, speaks quite loudly to anyone who comes across it, really. Which I guess runs into something else I wanted to ask you, which was that, you wrote about this album that came out in 1981. It's 2022 now, but why do you think it resonates so strongly with people now, as it has done for the last 40 years?
That's a good question. I think there's two things. One is the sound of the album, and one is the concept of the album. So if I talk about the sound, it's kind of like, you've never heard anything like this. It's so sort of like unique and encapsulated, and so to describe it, it's like you can hear it in 1981, but you could hear it now and still go, wow, there's something so modern about this still today. So I think the sound, what they achieved was unique. Remembering that that part of their project was anti-rock. So, when Autobahn came out, it did so. Remember, Bruce, there's a 3-minute version of this 20-minute one side of an album called Autobahn. Some genius record exec in New York decided we could cut it down to 3 minutes and maybe it's going to be a hit in America. Who would have thought? It actually was crazy. So this is about 1973, isn't it? 73, 74. So that became a hit, a top 10 hit in America, which meant that from that point on, they were independent. They didn't ever have they licensed to a record company. They didn't have to have an advance. They built their Kling Klang studio, which was their version of Andy Warhol's factory. That was like, no one was allowed in there except the 4 of them. And by the way, it was built in an old boot factory in the industrial part of, like a kind of a industrial area of Dusseldorf. It was kind of like their factory. They will go and hammer out some music. They always talk about, we go there 9 to 5. We do our music, then we go to the nightclubs. Like they were kind of like factory workers, in that sense. But so I've just lost my train. Where were we going with this? We were talking about.
I guess why it resonates with people.
Yes,
still to this
sound.
day.
Yeah, so because they were thank you, with Autobahn being so successful, it meant that they could actually buy instruments. So they got rid of all their kind of electric instruments, all their kind of traditional instruments, and they decided we're only going using electronic synthesizers. So they could buy, Moogs were like so expensive, but they could buy them with their royalties. They actually had instruments made, and they even actually connected for the vocoder. They actually got involved in actually helping to create the vocoder. Like they were actually went into the laboratory and helped, even with IBM, they did work with them as well. So they kind of became this like laboratory of synthesizer music, and that was their anti-rock thing. They were like, right, we're doing this, we're going to produce it. So the sound is so unique because of this combination of different instruments and things like that, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also the concept. So the concept was high art, it was do you know Gilbert and George, those artists? Well, there's a reason why they Kraftwerk dressed with this, like, you know, it was a bit of a Gilbert and George homage. I'll just show you why I'm dressed like this tonight. Where is this one? Man Machine album. So I thought better dress up for that. But yeah, so actually there's so many influences from art and things like that. So I think that's maybe the other reason why is because they're so unique is their concept, their music, their sound, which then kind of, I say, created the 80s sound. You know, and that includes hip hop, like Planet Rock, one of the first hip hop songs, sampled numbers from this album, and Trans-Europe Express. Techno, so in Detroit, Kraftwerk are gods. Like, they said, they're so straight, they're funky. That's it's so precise, it's funky. You know, techno, so many different styles of music, you know, like Britpop, not Britpop, you know, like Depeche Mode and on all of those early 80s synth pop bands, with all homage to
well, should we illustrate to those gathered here some of the sonic reference points that you're talking about with a little sample?
Oh, cool! Yes.
Yeah, let's do that. So this is the title track, "Computer World" by Kraftwerk. Maybe I'll bump it up a little bit.
I still love it after all these years. I'm sure you guys do too, eh?
I don't remember whether I downloaded the English or the German version. I guess we'll find out.
Now this next bit I'm going to talk about. Okay, we pause it there.
Yeah, let's leave it there.
I just want to say something about that. So that numbers, that's actually, this is the innovation that they had. You remember the speak and spell toy that was about teaching how to spell and stuff? Florian wrote into the speak and spell toy numbers and then pressed and recorded it. So that second, after they go FBI and all that, that second bit is all a speak and spell, which is just blew my mind when I was actually really looking into it. It's like, what? Wow. Yeah. Should I say something a bit more about the instruments and things? Or?
Yeah, if you'd like to. I think because so many of them are so unique and so special. And I guess one thing I was thinking about, I watched this funny documentary about computers in the Soviet Union in a similar time recently, in a late night YouTube hole. And I guess it's funny to think about now how computers are so ubiquitous that here with this thing that weighs, half a kilo, you asked, can you download this song? It took me, 20 seconds to get it from the ether.
Yep.
But back then computers were something quite shocking. There were these enormous, arrays of things bigger than most cars that, took several people to program and, had less computing power than this thing I've got on my wrist. So, but they took up the challenge of dealing with these profoundly complex machines, many of which were, Japanese or American, and there wasn't a lot of cross-compatibility. So, but would you like to speak more about those instruments?
Yeah, so in terms of there's two things. There was those complex machines. So yes, they had a synthesizer maker in Bonn called Weiches and Matten or something like that, who actually made instruments just for them, particularly sequencers, because one of their really big things that they did that sequence sound, that was called a synthenorma sequencer, which was actually built for Kraftwerk. They also had drum machines built for them as well. They actually created vocoders and particular things. But they also used some of those unique things that, like David Bowie used on Station to Station. So they had a Vaco orchestron, which gave that kind of a choral sound on Radioactivity, and they used like the EMS Synthia, which Brian Eno, the suitcase synth, which is actually worth a lot of money now. But they had some of those squiggles on like numbers and pocket calculator, and also the ARP Odyssey, which is a very famous synth. I think Gary Newman used that a lot, and the Mini Moog and those sorts of instruments. So they had this array of technology, but they also had what I was saying before, like a speak and spell. And then on numbers, they had they used a translator, Texas Instruments translator kind of module, and where they wrote in the thing, and then it would say it in numbers in Japanese or whatever. So they like to use everyday objects of consumerism, and that's, I think, one of the things about Kraftwerk is they loved industry, they loved technology, and they loved kind of the everyday object. And so that's why I think Computer World is actually a kind of an ode to technology. It's like a love letter to technology. And that Computer World song, it just feels warm, doesn't it? I was talking to B, and we played, of course we played it on the way here, and we were saying, just doesn't it sound like they're in love with the computer? It's a love letter. And I think at the time they had the big clunky machine computers, but at the point of 1981 was the cusp where personal computing was starting to come in. So sometimes people say, oh, they were predicting the future. I don't think so. I think they were observing the present. And then, they were interested in some things as well. They loved the technology, but they also could see some warnings in it. So, in the song, they talk about FBI, Deutsche Bank. It's so ahead of its time. They're actually talking about security and personal information. They'd had this experience where they'd come back from tour, crossing the borders back into Germany, and they were like, they just noticed all of this now using computers, more security details about they wanted their license and they want to enter that information into the computer at the border and things like that. So I think they were starting to observe what we experience now around security and things like that. So they were kind of prescient. So it was this dichotomy. They loved technology, they loved it, but they also were aware of some of the dangers of it as well. So maybe, and one more thing. They also, I think, were recognising that work, because they were a bit obsessed with work, factories and industrial type of work, but they could recognise that work was starting to change. They were starting to think, well, if you've got your home computer, maybe work will transfer to home as well. So in a sense, that's probably more where they were predicting the changes in society. So there's always a lot more going on with Kraftwerk than, but it's so simple at the same time. That's enough.
No, thank you. I think there are certainly parts of the book where you're very much focusing on research and factoring that into like a grand narrative of understanding, this music and these artists. And then there are parts where you kind of venture off into your own thoughts and ponderings. There were some sections that I thought were really, really beautiful and spoke to your deep appreciation and understanding of this stuff. So maybe if I could read two quick passages that really spoke to me. They were, all music, it can be argued, involves music and change. Kraftwerk's particular point of difference, though, was the fact that the forms they sought to recreate and represent were the structured, repetitive, clockwork heartbeats of industry, the machines, cars, trains, robots, computers, rather than the organic and chaotic patterns and forms of society, people, nature, flora and fauna. And then you say, the band used the idea of music as motion as part of their project of distancing themselves from the cliched tropes of rock, which they characterised as a stable format. Wanting to avoid that box, Kraftwerk described their electronic music as very liquid situation, like mercury. And I think that in that audio example that we listened to of Computer World, it really comes through that there's this kind of, even though it is so mechanical and there's like a rigidity to it and very much a feeling of static, simultaneously there's a lot of that kind of flow and like bounce that really comes through with those sounds. I think it's that pre-digital analog computing that kind of has that magic and that quality that still sparkles, because we're so used to very ubiquitous, dry, very digital experiences now. So I thought that was a really nice note that you opened up there in the text. I guess moving on from them alone, I was interested in perhaps getting some of your thoughts about what else was going on with other musicians around the world. I was thinking about other people who had factored synthesizers in a kind of a way that's now very part of our culture, but was quite even controversial at the time, or kind of shocking. So I was thinking about people like Yellow Magic Orchestra from Japan, who are now kind of held in a very same revered status. And then maybe another band that I don't feel like has the same reverential status perhaps, but I think is maybe just as important, and that is Devo of Whippet fame. And maybe I was interested to know whether you did know more about Devo, and actually when you popped in the other day, turns out you are yourself a Devo fan.
Love Devo.
Yeah. Devo too.
There's a lot of devotees around.
Yes.
Dad jokes, are they allowed? No.
Oh, absolutely. Please. Maybe would you be interested in expanding upon perhaps thinking about people who are doing similar things, where the similarities are, but perhaps where the differences are that made you focus on Kraftwerk and say, this is the one I'm going to go for this period?
Thanks, Nico. And yeah, awesome to be able to talk about Devo as well. Hey, I love Devo. But just think about the differences between them, because or the similarities. Obviously, they both work in electronic idiom. Having said that, Devo did use a lot of guitar, more guitar than people remember in their music, particularly up to Freedom of Choice. But if I was really to think about it, I've talked about Kraftwerk as like they love technology, that I need to quote David Bowie in every time I talk. So he said about Kraftwerk, it's like folk music of the factories, assembly line music, noise music to increase productivity. So as we know, so that was their focus, their love of technology. In terms of Devo, they were, it wasn't about love, they were angry. They had a punk energy, and they had a kind of, almost a situationist kind of philosophy of deconstruction. And or
even devolution.
Or devolution, yes. So they were kind of angry about consumerism, about the West, about the military-industrial complex. So their project was really about, and they've got that song "Love" from the awesome album. Just forgotten the one with "Beautiful World" on it. New Traditionalists. They've got a song called "Love Without Anger Isn't Love at All." They're just always angry about stuff in a very kind of straight-laced way. So yeah, I would say, and they're always commenting on consumerism in a negative way. So like, freedom of choice is what you got. Freedom from choice is what you want. So like, so profound actually. Again, but similar to Kraftwerk, very simple in what they're saying, but profound. So, and always very sarcastic. So Beautiful World and all of those sort of things. So I would say that they share some DNA, but they kind of focus on technology in the world in very different ways. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Oh, definitely, absolutely. I did want to play another musical example, maybe to illustrate some of the influence that this particular Kraftwerk album has had. And now that I think about how I've structured this, I think I'm going to do a bit of sacrilege, but I'm going to go from one of the most angsty, famous bands in history to perhaps one of the wettest in history.
All right, let's...
But it will illustrate the point very well in terms of influence. So I'm going to play 2 tracks, and then I'd like you to reflect upon them with an anecdote instead. Not to put you on the spot, but I think you'll know what I'm talking about.
You are putting me on the spot.
So this first one is Kraftwerk's Computer Love from this album.
It's my favourite track on the album.
you'll see why. Now, I must say, I had that CD when I was 12 years old. Not as cool as having Kraftwerk when you were 12 years old. Steve, would you be able to tell us a bit about those two tracks and perhaps what separates them and what makes them very similar?
Well, I'll say what makes them similar. So that was Coldplay, of all bands. That they were following up their A Rush of Blood to the Head album with X and Y, and of course, to keep themselves edgy, they got Eno involved. So Eno produced that album, and they hit a wall where they'd kind of like, they'd written a whole bunch of songs, but they were like, oh, we're a bit bereft of inspiration at this point. So they thought, I wouldn't have known Coldplay's favourite band was Kraftwerk, but there you go. But you know, I think I'm continually surprised about who likes Kraftwerk. So anyway, the story goes that they thought, well, we haven't got any song ideas at the moment. Why don't we borrow the riff from one of the best ever songs that we love, Computer World. So the story goes that they, Chris Martin, the lead singer, phone, because you can't contact them. Like they supposedly they had a phone at Clink Clank Studio, but they would never answer it. And the only way you could contact them was by faxing their lawyers in Dusseldorf. So Chris Martin put together this request, had it translated to German, faxed it through to the, and of course they never answer for ages. So supposedly the answer came back about whether they could use the riff 6 months later. So I think they'd actually had to stop recording, kind of like just wait on it, because I think they thought this is going to be a hit if we can get it over the line. There's two versions of the reply. One was this faxed reply back from Ralph saying with the word yes. So computer says yes. The other one was, and I wrote this down, yes, you can use it. Thank you very much for asking my permission, unlike that bastard Jay-Z. So, I kind of like that second version of the story. But they went on to have a big hit with the song. And I guess it speaks to the fact that, to bring it back to Kraftwerk, because that's more interesting, but is their simplicity of their melodies just really shine through. You don't even have to like electronic music, you just have to listen to their songs and just the simplicity of the melodies. And I think, Nico, we were talking about there's lots of cover versions of Kraftwerk songs, and I've heard country versions of Kraftwerk songs, and just in so many different idioms, reggae even. But I think the strength of their songwriting comes through because those melodies are so strong. So I think using an example like Coldplay is a good one to kind of highlight that that they were songwriters as well as arch conceptualists. So high and low.
Because they borrowed that riff, but they also borrowed the sound of the album very much as well. Because up to that point, Coldplay, not to digress too much into talking about Coldplay and we're at a Kraftwerk event, but anyway, they borrowed that riff, but then they also took that very heavy synthesizer sound.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of wrapped up that sound in a way that kind of shot them from being like a pretty big band to now where I think Coldplay is still maybe the biggest band in the world that isn't One Direction, if they were still a thing. Or maybe what's coming out of Korea, that tends to be dominating now.
But isn't that interesting about Brian Eno, one of the most, to divert to something else, another passion, Brian Eno, Bruce and a few people here, how involved he's been in with some of the big, so he created ambient music, created all this. He produced the first Devo album, but at the same time he also produced U2's Achtung Baby, which brought them from, and also Unforgettable Fire, but brought them right back to an experimental mode. So he connects the DNA of so many different bands. And it was Brian Eno and David Bowie together that, well, Brian went to Germany, recorded with Harmonia and Cluster, and helped turn David onto Kraftwerk and the German sound. And then David incorporated that into Station to Station. And then, of course, they used to hang out a bit. So David wanted to produce a Kraftwerk album. Actually, we were talking about it. They ended up just having lots of cups of tea in Dusseldorf and hanging out at nightclubs and things. But he said they're the future, Kraftwerk and the future of music, David said. We believe what David says. Yeah.
He said that about Lord.
He said that about Lord too, didn't he, Bruce? But yeah. Anyway, that's good.
It's not always right.
Nico, another question. She's good, but yeah.
I guess maybe I was thinking a lot about how so much of this sound that they influenced, particularly in North America throughout the 1980s, that spun off into hip hop and then techno and house music, and then back to Europe, where now like techno is basically synonymous with Berlin, and of course they were separated by a cruel division, but that music really came back to Germany, kind of recycled in a different way. And I guess, did you have any other thoughts about that influence and where it sits with music today?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Sorry.
If I reflect on what, the techno producers said about Kraftwerk, I think that they were like, that line I said before, like Derek May and people like that would say they were so straight, they were funky. And I think when some of our mutual friend Adam Rudiger, who helped me actually analyse, because in the book I kind of talk about conceptualisation, give some background to Kraftwerk and those sorts of things. But then the last chapters are about, I go through each song and unpack it from lyrically what they're doing, but also musically. And Adam helped me understand that there was this mixture of, it's not quite on, there's some things are really on the beat, really precise, and because it's analog, there's some things that are slightly not quite on the beat, and that's what gives it the funk. It's kind of like, you've got to be on the one, look at that, on the one. But then it's the slightly off that gives syncopation, which gives the funk of it, and that's what I think. Actually, modern techno has kind of lost a little bit of that. It's almost too precise. They took that bit, but people would forget that also Kraftwerk were precise, but they're also very human. So it was like the robots, yes, but it was very human music because the vocals are very fragile, often like Computer Love, very fragile and sweet, kind of like forlorn, almost sad, almost. But then also the humour. So that sometimes people forget the humour, and that was really Florian. He embodied the humour. His face, he was always just got this smirk, this wry kind of look on his face. So I think the modern dance music has taken a lot of the precision and some of the innovation, but I think it's lost a little bit of the human as well. But that's not how it goes. It's just it's evolved from this.
I think with like the software that people use to make music now, the quantization, which is the process of blocking beats to beats really, really stringently, has gotten so precise that people feel like you need to reinsert some chaos. So you can download programs that actually make it go off the grid for you to make it a bit more human, which just seems like, what?
Very postmodern.
Of course.
Post-human. More human than human.
And speaking of their humour, I think Kraftwerk, I'd love to know what they think about being a band that has the most absurd and funny aping of them in a famous Hollywood film, which is The Big Lebowski and The Nihilists, who was somewhere between Divo and Kraftwerk back here. And I can't show that here in the store tonight because it's M15 plus.
Yeah, it's a family environment.
Yeah, this is a safe space, I guess before we wrap up tonight, Steve, I guess I would like to know if anyone here tonight had a question for you. Does anyone have any particular questions for Steve?
Just noticed that when you were speaking about it, you said that there were it brought together 4 people, but when I can't remember his name exactly, but maybe Schultz or something,
yeah.
he said 3. So what's the difference?
So that's a good question. So the classic lineup of Kraftwerk is the founders, Ralph and Florian. And in the early days, there's actually an album called Ralph and Florian, and they had a bit of a mixed lineup at that point. Then the third person that Emil was referring to was himself. So they met him at art college. He was their art director, so he created that the Computer World cover, also the Autobahn cover and Radioactivity. He also wrote lots of their lyrics. He wrote Computer World lyrics. He also was their road manager. On Autobahn, he actually played violin and guitar. And so he also was their arch conceptualist. So I call him the fifth Beatle. He was always there. So then he faded into the background, and then Wolfgang came in on electronic drums. They actually created these little drum pads. If you ever see Doco, there's them on World of Tomorrow or something like that on BBC, and they've got these Germans with their very newfangled instruments, and Wolfgang actually had made these like drum pads and it was like a metal stick with a little wire, and it was tick, tick, tick. And then also Carl Bartos joined, so he was a multi-instrumentalist. So that was the sort of the classic lineup. So it was the four of them plus Emil. And for the book, I got to know Emil very well. He's a really beautiful space cadet. He's an artist. He's still an artist, and we're going to play some of that later.
Yeah, we actually have a very special thing, which is a little video message from Emil. I'm afraid I've only got my little laptop here, but gather around if you like.
So I asked him to sort of say hi, so give us a little message.
How's that? Can everyone see?
Can't hear it though. Let me get that fixed up.
Hello and down under from Viersen, Germany. This is Emil Schult, and I'm sending out my greetings to Steve Francis and his spectacular book release tonight. Hope you're all having a good time. You're in a wonderful location. I saw the outside of the hotel. It's all green, it's modern, and that's how we want to go. This is my latest album. It's called Transhuman Art Critics.
Yeah, I mean, he deserves respect for doing the plug.
And that's what we all have in mind. Let's update this world. Let's update the future. You can see I'm still busy. My studio is full of work, various periods. Here's a nice new piece. It's a model of the James Webb telescope, which is in space now, and various other space paintings. I love this universe and I love this world, and I just hope we can all get together and get this thing out of its crisis. First time in Australia in 1981, I remember I met some young artists that were just forming a group called Midnight Oil, I guess you know what I'm talking about, and I'm so happy that people are still enjoying our work, and I hope the same for Steve and all of you, that your work will be appreciated as long as you live, and that's why I can say see you later.
He's such a nice person. That's good. He's such a beautiful person, and I just love the bit where he goes, and here are some space paintings. And he was actually in the video. He's walking past the original Autobahn cover, and then at the back there's the Trans-Europe Express, kind of like, so pretty amazing.
But it's really special that you got that message from him. That's a real link to our musical history. That's really special. And this book is really special, Steve. We have plenty of copies here, and I'd strongly urge you to grab one. Steve, I reckon if you'd like to do a signing, that'd be really fantastic.
No worries, I brought a Sharpie just in case.
Oh, you came prepared, fantastic.
Can I show you also a few things?
Oh, please do.
I've still got my 3D glasses from, I went to and I've got my ticket still too. This was at the Opera House in 2013, I think, and they did Computer World in full with some other in 3D, with spectacular 3D. They actually did 8 nights of all the different albums, which was just amazing. And I brought some other show and tell. I got the German edition of the album Computer World in yellow vinyl, of course. I've got the live from the 3D catalogue. That's live Computer World, and then I've even recently got this little single from Electronic Sound magazine, Yellow. So I just thought and there's a guy on the Kraftwerk Facebook page who loves to make these, but I need a really long, wide car to put this one on. So look how big that is. Exactly. So, yeah. Anyway, some little knickknacks there.
The enthusiasm's good, and like it's valid for music like this that's of this profound and special nature. So thank you for writing this wonderful book. I had a lot of pleasure reading it and stitching out those funny anecdotes and the wisdom that you got from from the source itself. And thank you for coming and speaking with me and speaking for all of us here tonight for this wonderful event. I'd like to thank you very, very much, and I hope you all give Steve a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Nico, so much for hosting tonight and for Readings for inviting me. This feels really cool. I went to Melbourne Uni and I always came here and was like, oh wow, this is a bucket list tick off this one tonight. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for coming.
And yes, if you do want to grab a coffee, one of my colleagues at the front counter can help you out with one of those. And let's go have a really good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico.